Warrant of arrest has been issued for Prophet Shepherd Bushiri and his wife Mary, who fled back home to Malawi after being granted bail last week. Now, both South Africa and Malawi are signatories to the SADC extradition protocols. But what happens if Malawi, for example, refuses to hand over the effective fugitives? And why is there no bilateral agreement on extradition between South Africa and Malawi? Let's get you some analysis on the story now. We're joined by Advocate Anton Katz. He joins us live from Cape Town. Advocate Katz, good morning. Once again, thanks for your time this morning. The question, I suppose, is it enough that our two countries are signatories to the SADC extradition protocols, to get the Bushiris back to South Africa?
Good morning, Michelle. Let me try to give an overview of how extradition works so that it'll maybe give some context to your question and provide some answer. The real issue is, what do the laws of Malawi say about what happens when a foreign state, such as South Africa, send an extradition request to Malawi? As soon as that happens, Malawi's laws kick in. The fact that South Africa and Malawi are party to an extradition agreement called the SADC Protocol on Extradition, it's a 2002 multilateral agreement, is only a factor that will be taken into account under the laws of Malawi. So, for example, in South Africa, if South Africa receive a request, an extradition request from a foreign state to which South Africa is not a party, let's say there's a country X, and the country X hasn't got an extradition treaty with South Africa, and they send a request. South Africa's domestic laws, the national law of South Africa, the Extradition Act of 1962, allows for South Africa to respond positively to that request from a non-treaty state. So the real question is, what do Malawi's laws say about a request of this kind from South Africa? You introduced your question by saying, what happens if Malawi refuse to respond positively, or they don't extradite the Bushiris back to South Africa were there to be a request? I don't know whether there has been one. There may or may not. That's a factual question which is only the two governments know. Well, the real answer is there could be a dispute between the two states as to whether or not Malawi have complied with its international obligation to South Africa. So once they are parties to a treaty, that treaty gives and obliges states party to the treaty to do certain things and not to do certain things. And the question as to whether one state or another has violated that treaty is something that will be determined as time goes on. So, for example, I'll give you a simple example. Let's assume Malawi take the view that because the Bushiris are Malawian nationals, they will not extradite them at all to any country. Then the SADC protocol requires Malawi to prosecute them in Malawi, as an example.
Right. But
that will all depend on Malawian law. So that, for example, in South Africa, there's no provision for a non-extradition of a South African citizen. In Angola and Mozambique, and those, let's call it states, which come from the continent with civil law states, Portuguese, Spanish, French, those states and Germany and Japan never extradite their own citizens but prosecute them in their home countries. English-speaking countries, those Commonwealth countries, all do extradite their own citizens. So it will all depend on what Malawian law says about the particular situation. If what I've read in the newspaper, in the media, is to the effect that the Bushiris would claim that were they to be extradited, they couldn't obtain a fair trial in South Africa, that really isn't something that the Malawian courts or the Malawian executive should consider, unless it's outrageously shown that, well, it's shown that they would be treated outrageously, such as torture or the death penalty. But otherwise, there shouldn't really be an issue. Let me just say, the last thing that I want to say is, a country such as Malawi would have both its courts and its executive, the minister or the relevant minister. Some countries have it the Minister of Justice, some it's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, some it's Home Affairs, deciding the kinds of issues that extradition requires. In South Africa, it happens to be the Minister of Justice. And in other countries, it's the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But the point I wanted to make was that ultimately, when a minister makes a decision of this kind, it has what I would call international political consequences and ramifications. And what sometimes and does often happen is one country would say to another country, look, we will extradite this person if you, the requesting state, give us food aid or medical aid, or vote in a particular way at a multilateral in a multilateral organization such as the UN or the African Union. So, for example, a country might say to South Africa, we'll return the person to you if you vote with us on an LGBT resolution that's being debated at the Security Council or in the African Union particular route. So those are some of the ideas that I give you in answer to the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre that, talking to your last point there, that Malawi might agree to the extradition if South Africa can then come to the party in one way or another. Is it bizarre that Malawi would then be the country sort of holding the cards, so to speak, when it's their own citizens who skipped the country in a 100 million rand fraud case?
I'm not sure it's bizarre, because every country, the whole notion of a sovereign state is that a state has jurisdiction and control over its territory and over the persons who are on that territory. It would be, when you use the word bizarre, it would certainly be possibly a rule of law, a violation of the rule of law, both Malawian law and international law, were a country such as Malawi to take a view that, well, we will give the Bushiris back if certain conditions were met which are unrelated to the Bushiris.
Yeah.
So, for example, they could say, well, if we send the Bushiris back, then let's make sure that they're not subject to harsh prison conditions. That wouldn't be bizarre. But it could be bizarre for them to say, well, we will send the Bushiris back if, and then there's some condition which is unrelated to the Bushiris at all. That would be a violation of the rule, but it does happen. That was my point.
Yeah,
it happens often.
And Advocate Katz, what are the optics for how South Africa comes out of this saga, what our image looks like at the end of it? First of all, the Bushiris were able to make a run for it. We don't have any record of them crossing any border in South Africa. And then if, let's say, the extradition talks also don't yield the result of bringing the Bushiris back to the country to face justice, to face their day in court here in South Africa, what does that do for the optics of our country?
Yeah, it certainly wouldn't, I would have thought, provide a positive image of South Africa's border controls generally. And our justice system would come under some kind of scrutiny, in the sense that here are people who are granted bail in a fair public hearing, and they just ignore the bail without any checks and balances by the security officers and border control, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So I see the Minister of Home Affairs has been summoned to Parliament today to give an explanation of how that happened. The second issue is, more importantly, I think, what would the optics be from Malawi's perspective were it to ignore or refuse without justification any extradition request by South Africa? And one would have thought, in a case such as this, where a couple are standing before a court in a serious fraud, or I think it's fraud, charges, pervasive fraud charges in a court, who skip bail, and an extradition request comes shortly after the flight, and the home country doesn't deal with it in a speedy, swift, and let's call it a legal way. I think the optics from a Malawian perspective would be somewhat compromised. Yeah,
very interesting indeed. Advocate Anton Katz, thanks so much for your time this morning on the AM Report, joining us there via our video link. In Cape Town, it is a developing story as we continue to track the issue around the Bushiris skipping the country. A warrant of arrest has now been issued for both Prophet Shepherd Bushiri and his wife Mary. We're told that there are now talks between the South African government and the Malawian government around the possibility of extradition.